I installed a secret camera after my wife kept leaving every night and going into the same neighbor's house like she was hiding a double life. But when I watched the footage, the truth hit harder than I ever could have imagined. But before I begin, please like and subscribe to the channel. And we'd love to hear which part of the world are you joining us from. Let us know. Now, let's dive into today's story. Roy Mercer was not the kind of man who drew attention to himself. He drove a 10-year-old pickup truck with a small dent above the rear wheel well that he kept meaning to fix. He wore the same style of work boots every season, steel-toed, dark brown, resoled twice. He had a routine, and he kept to it. He worked as a maintenance supervisor at Kellerman Industrial, a manufacturing plant 14 miles outside Spokane, Washington. It was not glamorous work. It was not the kind of job you described at dinner parties. But it was honest, and Roy understood honest work the way some people understood music, instinctively, deeply, without needing to explain it to anyone. He managed a crew of 9 men. He scheduled repairs, tracked equipment failures, and made sure a facility producing parts for agricultural equipment ran without interruption. When something broke, Roy was the first one called. When Roy arrived, things got fixed. That was the deal, and he had honored it for 11 years. The neighborhood where he and Nancy lived sat 6 miles east of downtown Spokane, in a stretch where pine trees lined both sides of the road and the houses were modest but well kept. Roy had purchased the house 4 years before he married Nancy. It was a 2-bedroom with a covered front porch and a backyard large enough for the vegetable garden he planted every spring. He had chosen it carefully. He had paid for it carefully. And he maintained it the same way he maintained everything in his life, steadily, without drama, without complaint. Nancy Mercer had not grown up with that kind of patience. She had been raised by parents who moved often and spent freely, and she carried that restlessness into adulthood like a piece of luggage she had never learned to set down. When Roy first met her, he had taken that energy for enthusiasm. She was bright and quick-witted and funny in the way that catches a person off guard, and she had a way of making an ordinary Tuesday feel like something worth remembering. He fell in love with that version of her, honestly and completely. But versions change. By their 5th year of marriage, Nancy had developed a vocabulary Roy did not share. She talked about upgrading, the house, the car, the neighborhood, the furniture. She scrolled through real estate listings the way other people scrolled through photographs, searching for something, always disappointed by what she already had. She subscribed to lifestyle newsletters and home renovation accounts, and she framed her dissatisfaction in the language of aspiration, as though wanting more was the same as working toward something. Roy never dismissed her entirely. He talked with her about budgets, about what was realistic, about what 2 people could afford on his salary from the plant, and her part-time work coordinating events for a local venue. Those conversations were patient and practical, and they went nowhere. "You think small," she told him one evening, not looking up from her phone. She was sitting in the leather recliner she had insisted on buying 18 months earlier, the one that had strained the monthly budget in a way Roy still felt. He was at the kitchen table going through a stack of bills, the electric, the water, the second mortgage payment she had pushed him to take out for the kitchen renovation. "I think stable," he replied. She made a small sound, somewhere between a laugh and a dismissal, and went back to her phone. Roy set down the electric bill and looked at her for a moment. She was not looking back. She rarely was anymore. He thought about saying more, then decided against it. There was a particular kind of silence that grows in a marriage when 2 people stop reaching toward each other. Roy had been living inside that silence for a while. He just hadn't named it yet. He gathered the bills into a neat stack, clipped them together, and went to bed. The first time Roy noticed Nancy leaving the house at night, he thought nothing of it. It was a Wednesday in late October. He was in the garage replacing the brake pads on the pickup when he heard the front door open and close. He glanced at the clock above the workbench, 9:47 p.m. He heard her car start. He heard her pull away. When she came back around 11, she told him she had gone to the gym. He nodded and went back to the equipment manual he was reading in bed. He didn't follow up on it. He had no reason to. But it happened again the following week. Wednesday again, a little before 10. And then Thursday the week after. And then twice in the same week, different nights. Roy was not a man prone to suspicion. He extended good faith the way he extended every other resource in his life. Carefully, but genuinely. 11 years of maintenance work had made him observant, though. He noticed patterns the way a good mechanic notices a sound that repeats at irregular intervals, quietly and without alarm, but with complete attention. And something in the rhythm of his house had quietly changed. He started paying attention. Nancy's explanations shifted as the weeks passed. The gym became running an errand. The errand became meeting a friend. The friend was never named the same way twice. When Roy asked who, she answered the way people answer questions they consider too small to take seriously. Just Patty from work. You don't know her. Roy did not press. He filed the information away. It was a Friday in mid-November when he first noticed the direction she walked. He was on the front porch, a cup of coffee going cold beside him, watching the street because he needed the air after a long shift. Nancy came out at 9:45, jacket on, phone already in her hand. She walked down the front path and turned left. Across the street and 2 houses down, the porch light was on at the Holloway place. Trent Holloway had moved into the neighborhood about 14 months earlier. Roy knew him the way you know most neighbors on a quiet street. By sight, by a nod at the curb, by the occasional "how are you" exchanged over a property line. Holloway was in his mid-40s, divorced, no kids that Roy had heard of. He worked some kind of contracting job that kept unpredictable hours. His truck was there some mornings and gone for days at a time. He was not unfriendly. He was not the kind of man you thought about at all. Roy watched Nancy walk down the sidewalk. He watched her turn up Holloway's front path. He watched her go inside without knocking. He sat there for a long time, the cold coffee in his hand, the pine trees dark and motionless in the November air. He didn't yell. He didn't move. He just sat there, turning over what he had seen, feeling the sharp, quiet edge of it settle in his chest the way a cold draft finds the gap under a door. Not dramatically, not all at once, just steadily, until the cold is simply there. Then he got up, poured the coffee in a yard, and went inside. He ordered the camera online 2 days after the night on the porch. It arrived Thursday afternoon. A small, weatherproof unit with night vision and motion-activated recording that synced directly to his phone. He paid from the personal account Nancy did not have access to, the one he used for tools and work supplies. The purchase looked like nothing. It was nothing, technically, just a piece of hardware. Installing it took 20 minutes. He mounted it above the garage door, angled toward the street. The natural position for a security camera, not worth a second look. The field of view covered the front path, the sidewalk, and a clean line of sight to the Holloway driveway. He tested the footage, adjusted the angle twice, and was satisfied. He mentioned it to Nancy that evening. Added some security coverage. Good idea, she said, and went back to what she was doing. Roy went into the kitchen, made dinner, and set Nancy's plate on the counter without comment. She ate half of it, excused herself to watch something in the bedroom, and left her glass on the table. He washed the dishes, dried them, put them away in the exact right places. Then he sat down at the table with his phone and pulled up the camera app. No footage of note from the past 2 days. Just the pine trees and the quiet street and a neighbor's gray cat moving along the fence line at 3 a.m. He set the phone down and waited. It did not take long. That same night, a little before 10, the motion alert buzzed in his pocket. He opened the app. On the small screen, clear in the blue-white glow of the night vision, he watched Nancy come out the front door. She was wearing the gray jacket he had given her for Christmas 3 years ago. She moved quickly, purposefully, and she did not look back. She crossed the street, walked up Holloway's front path, and let herself in through the front door without knocking. Roy set the phone face down on the table. He folded his hands together and stared at the far wall. He sat that way for a while, long enough for the kitchen to become very quiet and very still around him, long enough for the hum of the refrigerator to feel like the loudest thing in the house. He picked the phone back up and watched the footage again. He watched it a second time. Then he saved it to the same secure cloud backup he used for work records, organized by date, the way he organized everything. He was not surprised. That was the part that settled in him most heavily. He had known, in the way you know things before you are ready to name them, the gut knowledge that precedes the mind's acceptance. The camera had not told him anything new. It had only confirmed what he already understood. He said it quietly, to no one, to the empty kitchen. All right, now I know. And then Roy Mercer got up from the kitchen table, turned off the light, and went to bed. He lay in the dark with his eyes open for a while, very still, and he began to think clearly. For the next 2 weeks, Roy kept the camera running and his face neutral. He watched the footage every morning before work, brief and businesslike, the way he reviewed maintenance logs. Nancy walked to Holloway's house an average of 4 times a week. Sometimes she stayed 2 hours. Sometimes she stayed until nearly midnight. Once on a Saturday when Roy said he was going fishing with a colleague from the plant, she was there by noon and didn't come back until mid-afternoon. Roy had not gone fishing. He had parked his truck 2 blocks away and watched the clock. He did not confront her. There was a reason for that. Roy had learned, over 11 years of maintenance work, that the worst thing you could do when something broke was react immediately. The instinct to fix was natural and understandable, But instinct without information produced larger problems. You looked first. You understood what you were dealing with. You gathered what you needed. Then you acted. So he watched. And he collected. The camera footage, time-stamped and organized by date. Notes recorded in a plain notebook he kept in the toolbox in the garage. Dates, times, durations, observed details, written simply and factually, without a single unnecessary word. His own observations noted with the same precision he brought to an equipment inspection. But there was still one thing he needed to see for himself. He chose a Tuesday night in mid-December. A light snow was falling. Not serious, just enough to dust the windshields and make the street look clean and quiet. He told Nancy he needed to run to the hardware store for a project he was planning for Saturday. She didn't ask which project. He drove around the block, parked on a parallel street, and walked through the snow to the back edge of Holloway's property. He stayed along the hedgerow at the property line. He stood in the cold with his hands in his jacket pockets and watched the back of Trent Holloway's house. The kitchen light was on. Through the thin curtain, two shapes moved, close together, easy with each other in the way of people who have been close for some time. Relaxed, familiar, uncalculated. Then the curtain shifted slightly, a heat vent probably, and for just a moment the gap was clear. Nancy was sitting on the kitchen counter near the window. Holloway was standing directly in front of her, saying something. And she was laughing. Not politely. Not for the benefit of anyone. Laughing the way she used to laugh with Roy in the early years. Full and unguarded and real, with no performance in it. Roy stood in the snow and looked at that. He felt something move through him. Not rage, exactly, but something colder and more clarifying. Like stepping out of a warm room into freezing air and understanding, with the absolute certainty of the body, exactly where you are. He turned around and walked back to his truck. He drove to the hardware store. He bought the part he had mentioned. He drove home. Nancy was still out. He made himself a cup of tea, sat at the kitchen table, and opened the notebook from the toolbox. He wrote the date. He wrote what he had observed. He wrote it plainly, without drama, with the same complete neutrality he brought to every other record in that book. He closed the notebook and put it away. He drank his tea until it was gone. There was no more waiting to be sure. There was no more benefit of the doubt. There was only the work ahead, and Roy Mercer had never been afraid of work. He called Lydia Cross on a Thursday morning from his truck in the parking lot at the plant before his shift. He had found her name through a coworker, not a close friend, just a man in the electrical department whose brother had gone through a difficult divorce 2 years earlier and come out of it with his finances intact. Roy had asked the question casually, over lunch, framed as asking for a friend. The coworker gave him the name without hesitation. Lydia Cross, family law, downtown Spokane. Sharp, thorough, fair. She had an opening the following Tuesday. Roy took it. Her office was on the 4th floor of a brick building on West Riverside Avenue, the kind of building that had been there long enough to feel both permanent and serious. The waiting room was small and orderly, with gray chairs and a window looking out over the street below. Roy arrived 7 minutes early and spent those minutes watching the cars move through the intersection. When the door opened, the woman who appeared was shorter than Roy had pictured, with dark hair pulled back and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead. She was somewhere in her late 50s, and she had the kind of calm, precise bearing that comes not from coldness, but from having sat across from a great many difficult situations and outlasted each one. "Mr. Mercer," she said, and shook his hand firmly. "Come in." Her office was clean and uncluttered, every surface clear except for a legal pad, a pen, and a glass of water. Roy sat across from her and explained everything in the order it had happened. No embellishment. Starting from the first pattern he noticed, moving through the camera installation, the footage, the notebook, the night he walked through the snow to the back of Holloway's property. He laid it all out the way he would lay out a maintenance problem. Start to finish, all the relevant facts, nothing extra. Lydia listened without interrupting. She took notes. When he finished, she set her pen down and looked at him. "Do you have children?" she asked. "No," Roy said. She nodded. "And the house? How was it purchased?" "I bought it 4 years before we married. My name only on the original deed. We refinanced together 6 years ago when she wanted to renovate the kitchen. Her name was added to the mortgage at that point." Lydia made a note. "Do you have the original purchase documents?" "In a fireproof lockbox at home. I can have them here by the end of the week." "Good." She looked up. "What are you hoping to achieve, Mr. Mercer?" Roy didn't hesitate. "I don't want drama," he said. "I want out, and I want to protect what's mine." She studied him for a moment. Not with suspicion, but with the focused attention of someone who needs to understand what a situation actually requires before she can do anything about it. Then we do this clean, she said. But we do it smart. Washington is a community property state, but prior ownership before marriage carries significant weight with strong documentation. The mortgage complicates things slightly, but it's manageable. She paused. I need you to do nothing differently at home until we're ready to file. No confrontations. No moving money. No closing accounts. Do you understand? Yes, Roy said. Joint accounts she has access to. One household account. We each contribute monthly for shared bills. I also have a personal savings account that's always been solely mine. She doesn't have access to it and never has. That's very helpful. Leave everything exactly where it is. Lydia set down her pen. One more thing. I need you to understand that she will likely contest this. People rarely accept less than they expected without a fight. This may become uncomfortable. Roy looked back at her evenly. I've been uncomfortable for a while, he said. I can manage it. Lydia Cross allowed herself the smallest of smiles. Good, she said. Then let's begin. Roy drove back to the plant in time for the afternoon shift. He changed into his work clothes, reviewed the maintenance log, and spent the rest of the day replacing a failed coolant line on one of the older press units. He worked carefully and without distraction, and by the time the shift ended, the press was running at full capacity. It was, Roy reflected as he locked up the supply room and walked to his truck, a productive day. Lydia needed 3 weeks to prepare. Roy gave them to her without complaint. He went to work. He came home. He ate dinner across the table from Nancy, who spent most meals looking at her phone or talking about nothing in the vague way of someone filling silence. He slept on the far side of the bed. He maintained the small, civil surface behaviors of a marriage that no longer had anything underneath them. Good morning, drive safe, here's your mail. He watched her leave the house at night and come back 2 hours later. He recorded it in the notebook and then closed the notebook and went to sleep. He was not a man built for pretense, but he was a man who understood that some things required patience, and he was patient. On the third Sunday of January, Lydia called to say the filing was ready. The documentation was in order: the original purchase records, the mortgage history, the refinancing papers, the bank records, the camera footage she had reviewed and confirmed would serve its purpose. The petition for dissolution of marriage was drafted. You can serve her this week, Lydia said. I'd recommend doing it yourself, at home, simply and without aggression. The cleaner this starts, the better your position if she tries to make it messy later. Roy thanked her and set the phone down. He printed the documents from the laptop in his home office, the one Nancy never touched, and set the papers on the kitchen table on a Tuesday evening while she was in the shower. He sat down and waited. When she came out, she was in a robe, drying her hair with a towel. She walked toward the kitchen for a glass of water and stopped when she saw the papers on the table. She stood there a moment, as though trying to decide if she had placed them there and forgotten. Then she read the top line. She went very still. You're joking, right? She said. She laughed once, a short, reflexive sound with no humor in it. No, Roy said. She stared at the papers. Roy watched the exact moment when her mind shifted from disbelief to calculation. Her jaw tightened. She set the water glass down slowly on the counter. You're throwing everything away, she said. Her voice had changed texture, not shocked anymore, but pointed. Over what, exactly? Roy kept his voice level. You stopped being my wife a while ago. The room went quiet. A car passed on the street outside. The refrigerator hummed. Her expression moved through something complex, something that might have been hurt for just a moment before it hardened into defense and then into something sharper. I was unhappy, she said. I've been unhappy for years, and you never did anything about it. I know, Roy said, and you made a choice. So did I. Her voice climbed. You think you can leave me with nothing? After everything I put into this marriage, you're going to hand me some papers and act like it's finished. Roy did not move. He did not raise his voice. He looked at her the same way he looked at every problem that needed solving, directly, without sentiment, and without any illusion about what he was looking at. We'll let the court decide, he said. She stared at him for a long moment. Her face was flushed. He could see the rapid rise and fall of her breathing. Whatever you think you know, she started. Nancy, he said quietly. I know exactly what I know. Silence. The longest one yet. She picked up the papers and held them without reading them. Then she set them back down, turned, and walked to the bedroom. The door didn't slam. That almost surprised him. It just closed, firmly and finally, and then the house was still again. Roy sat at the kitchen table for a while longer. He was not relieved. He was not angry. He was something much simpler and more durable than either of those things. He was decided. And once Roy Mercer decided something, the decision did not waver. He put the glass she had left on the counter into the sink. He turned off the kitchen light. He went to bed. Nancy did not go to a lawyer right away. For the first week, she tried a different approach, the kind Roy recognized from the earlier years of their marriage, when disputes had a way of resolving through pressure instead of resolution. She was cold and cutting, and she moved through the house like someone performing a scene of great suffering, waiting to be asked about it. Roy did not ask. He made his own meals, kept his own schedule, and communicated with her only about household logistics, who would be home for dinner, whether the furnace filter needed changing, whether the mail had come. He was not cruel. He was simply no longer available in the way she needed him to be. And there was a fundamental difference between those two things that Roy understood, even if Nancy did not. By the second week, she had found a lawyer. His name was Garrett Finch, with an office on the north side of the city in a shopping center suite that shared a parking lot with a sandwich shop. Roy learned this from Lydia, who called to tell him that Finch had made contact and that the process was about to accelerate. "She's going to make a claim on the house," Lydia said, "and she'll argue emotional neglect and financial control as grounds to seek a larger share of marital assets." "Emotional neglect," Roy repeated. "It's a common strategy," Lydia said without judgment. "The documentation we have will matter more than her framing." The filing process took 6 weeks. During that time, Nancy moved through 3 phases that Roy observed the way he observed most things, quietly, at a remove, without reaction. The first phase was hot anger, expressed in slammed cabinet doors and sharp comments about his deficiencies as a husband. The second phase was tears, intermittent and theatrical, usually appearing when she seemed to be expecting company. The third phase was strategy, the whispered phone calls from the bedroom, the late nights at the kitchen table with a legal pad and a pen, writing things and crossing them out again. Roy went to work. Roy came home. He maintained the house, paid the bills, and prepared for court the way he prepared for any complex job, carefully, without haste, and with his paperwork in order. The hearing was in March, on a Tuesday, in a courtroom on the second floor of the Spokane County Courthouse. The room was cool and plain, gray carpet, fluorescent lighting, a judge's bench that felt slightly too large for the space. Roy wore his one good suit, the navy one he had bought for a cousin's wedding 4 years ago. He had pressed it himself that morning. The judge was named Halverson, a man in his mid-60s with a careful, methodical way of working through information that reminded Roy of the senior engineers at the plant, men who had seen enough to know that patience was a tool, not a weakness. Garrett Finch presented Nancy's case with the practiced confidence of someone who had used the same arguments many times before. Nancy had been emotionally isolated. She had been excluded from financial decisions. She had contributed to the household in ways the asset structure didn't reflect. She deserved the house, or a significant portion of its value. She deserved a substantial share of Roy's pension and savings. Nancy sat beside Finch in a dark blouse and spoke carefully when asked to, with the measured earnestness of someone who had rehearsed. She did not look at Roy once. Then Lydia Cross presented Roy's case. She was methodical and unhurried. She laid out the original purchase documents, Roy's name, Roy's down payment, Roy's mortgage, for years before Nancy was in the picture. She presented the refinancing records and showed precisely what Nancy's name had and had not changed about the equity structure. She presented the household financials, every bill, every payment, a complete and unambiguous picture of who had funded what and for how long. Then she presented the camera footage. She did not editorialize. She did not need to. The footage did what footage always does. It showed what happened and when and how many times. Dates, timestamps, a neighbor's front door, a wife who did not knock. When the footage was displayed, Nancy's composure did not collapse dramatically. She didn't stand up or raise her voice, but something in her face shifted, a tightening around the eyes and mouth, the expression of a person watching the story they planned to tell come apart in real time. Finch tried to redirect. Halverson listened. He asked questions. He reviewed the documents with the same careful attention he brought to everything else. When both sides finished, Halverson took a recess. He returned 17 minutes later. He awarded Roy the house, with a buyout provision for Nancy's marginal equity contribution from the refinancing, a figure Lydia had anticipated and that Roy had already set aside in full. Nancy's claim to Roy's pension was denied. Her claim to his personal savings account was denied. The joint household account was split evenly. She received a modest declining monthly payment for 18 months, standard for a Washington divorce of this length. It was not nothing. Roy understood that, but it was a fraction of what she had walked into that courtroom expecting. Nancy stood up from the table as the session ended. Her lawyer was already gathering papers, expression professional and closed. She looked at Roy for the first time since the hearing began, directly, steadily, and with a look he recognized immediately. It was not grief. It was not acceptance. It was an accounting. "You think you won," she said, low enough that only he could hear. Roy looked at her calmly. "I don't think anything," he said. He turned, nodded once to Lydia, and walked out of the courtroom. Outside, the March sky was pale and overcast, the kind of Spokane day that could not quite decide between snow and resignation. Roy stood on the courthouse steps and breathed the cold air for a moment. Then he walked to his truck and drove back to his house. The house that had been his before any of this. The house that was still his. Nancy moved out on a Saturday in April with a rented van and a friend Roy did not recognize helping her carry boxes. Roy was not home when it happened. He had gone to the plant to complete an equipment inspection he had rescheduled twice. When he came back 3 hours later, her closet was empty, her side of the bathroom vanity was bare, and the leather recliner was gone, leaving a square of carpet slightly lighter than the rest of the floor. He stood in the living room and looked at that square for a moment. Then he got the vacuum out, cleaned the area, and went to make dinner. In the weeks that followed, Roy heard things the way you hear things in a neighborhood where people have lived beside each other long enough to notice changes. Not through gossip exactly, but through the ambient information of proximity. A neighbor mentioned it at the curb one morning, offhand. Another, a week later, over the back fence. Trent Holloway had left. The exact timing was unclear, but it appeared to have happened shortly after the divorce filing became public record, a particular kind of timing that, when you considered it, made perfect sense. Whatever Holloway had offered Nancy, or implied he could offer, it had apparently depended on conditions that no longer existed. The private version. The uncomplicated version. The one without courtrooms and camera footage, and a woman whose marriage was dissolving in a very public and documented way. The difficult version was apparently not what he had signed up for. His truck was gone from the driveway. The house went quiet. A rental sign appeared in the yard by mid-April. Roy noted this with the same steady attention he brought to everything. Not with satisfaction. Satisfaction implied he had been looking for something to feel good about. He had not been looking for anything. He was simply watching the world arrange itself into its natural shape. Nancy was renting a small apartment on the north side of the city, Roy heard. The monthly settlement payment was enough to cover the basics, barely. The events coordination work was part-time and had been cut further over the winter. She had been counting on different circumstances, on the house, on Roy's savings, on a number of things that a Tuesday morning in a Spokane courtroom had removed from the equation. Mutual acquaintances stopped calling, one by one, the way mutual acquaintances do when a situation becomes uncomfortable to be near. Roy knew this not because anyone reported it to him, but because he understood how proximity worked, had watched it operate in other people's lives, and felt no need to be surprised by it. He was not glad she was struggling. He was not engineering it or hoping for it. He had stopped thinking about Nancy Mercer the way you stop hearing a sound after it has been gone long enough. Not deliberately, but naturally, as the silence fills back in. He tended his garden that spring. The vegetable beds had fallen behind during the worst of the divorce proceedings, and he spent 3 weekends in April and May getting them back in shape. He turned the soil, added compost, planted tomatoes and peppers, and 2 long rows of green beans. He fixed the back fence where 2 posts had shifted over winter. He resealed the driveway. He replaced the dripping bathroom faucet he had been meaning to get to for 4 months. He got to it. It was a Tuesday night in late June when it happened. Roy had been asleep since around 10:30. The deep, unguarded sleep that comes to men who work physically and who have no great anxieties keeping them awake. His bedroom window was open an inch, the way he kept it from late spring through early fall. The night air was warm and smelled like pine and dry grass, and somewhere down the block a wind chime moved once and then went still. He heard something at 1:17 a.m. He knew the time because he looked at the clock the instant he woke, a habit built over years of being the person called for nighttime emergencies at the plant. The sound was at the back of the house. A faint metallic click, then silence. Then the soft, deliberate pressure release of the back door moving in its frame. Roy was on his feet before he had consciously decided to stand. 11 years of maintenance work had made him alert to small sounds in a way most people were not. Every building had its own language of creaks and pressures and settlings, and Roy knew this house's language the way he knew his own hands. That sound was not the wind. That sound was not the house cooling. That was a door being carefully opened. He stood in the dark of his bedroom and listened. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, on the kitchen tile, That particular soft percussion, the old linoleum, made under careful weight. Moving toward the hallway, Roy moved silently to the bedroom door. He grabbed his key ring from the hook beside the door as he passed, a reflex without a plan behind it, just the instinct of a man who did not leave things to chance. He opened the door just enough to see down the hall. The kitchen light was off. The hallway was lit only by the street light coming through the window at the far end, a pale, orange-tinged square against the dark. And moving into the entrance of that hall, slowly, deliberately, was a figure he recognized without any doubt. Nancy. She looked different in the dim light, but it was unmistakably her. The angle of her shoulders, the way she held her head, the small physical details that years of living alongside another person carved permanently into your recognition. She was in dark clothing. She was moving with the careful, considered pace of someone who had thought about this before arriving. And in her right hand, held low against her thigh, was a knife. Roy's kitchen knife, he realized immediately, the long one from the wooden block on the counter. Roy did not panic. That was not in his nature. But something moved through him in that instant. Cold and absolute and clarifying. The kind of attention that cuts away everything except the immediate facts of situation. She had broken into his house. She was holding a weapon. She had come here with a purpose. He stepped into the hallway. She saw him immediately and stopped. They stood about 15 feet apart in the dim orange light, looking at each other. Her face was not what he expected. He had expected hot, pointed anger. The kind he'd seen in the courthouse and at the kitchen table the night he served her. But this was something different. Her face was tight and exhausted, and something had drained out of her eyes that Roy had no exact word for. She looked like a woman who had traveled a long way to arrive somewhere she had not entirely planned to be. "You took everything from me," she said. Her voice was not loud. It shook slightly, in the way voices shake when someone is carrying more than they can hold. Roy said nothing. He was watching the knife. He was watching her feet. He was watching the distance between them. "I thought I was getting a better life," she said. Her voice climbed at the edges, unsteady, fraying. "I thought I finally knew what I deserved. And now I have nothing. Because of you." Roy kept his voice calm and even, the same tone he used with equipment on the edge of failure. Not commanding, not afraid, just present and clear. "Nancy, this isn't the way." She took a step forward. "Yes, it is." He watched her. She was not charging. She was working herself towards something in real time, convincing herself in the very act of speaking. That made her harder to read than simple rage. Rage had a direction. This had momentum without a clear destination. Roy began to move backward, slowly and steadily, toward the front of the house. He did not rush. He did not take his eyes from her. He spoke in the same measured, unhurried voice. "Whatever you're thinking," he said, "this makes everything worse for you. You understand that." She didn't answer. She took another step. The knife was still low at her side, but her grip on it had changed, tighter now, the knuckles pale even in the dim light. Roy reached the front door. He found the handle without looking, turned it, and stepped backward through the doorway in a single fluid motion. He pulled the door shut behind him and locked it with the key he was already holding. He stood on the front porch in his bare feet. The boards were cool under him. The June night was warm and very quiet. A moth circled the porch light above the door. Roy's hands were steady. He called 911. The dispatcher answered in 2 rings. Roy gave his address, his name, and the situation in the order they needed it. An intruder in the house, female, approximately 5'4", dark clothing, in possession of a kitchen knife. He kept his voice level and clear, the same voice he used when reporting a safety incident at the plant. Factual, concise, no wasted words. "Are you in a safe location, sir?" "I'm outside. Front porch. The door is locked. Can you see the intruder?" "No. I'm outside. Stay where you are. Officers are on their way." "Understood," Roy said. He stood on the porch and watched the street. The June night was still and warm, the pine trees dark against the sky that held just enough ambient light to see by. A dog barked somewhere a block away and then went silent. Roy watched the end of the street. Inside, there was silence. He did not try to learn what she was doing. He stayed on the porch, exactly where he was, exactly as instructed. The first cruiser arrived 4 minutes and 30 seconds after he made the call. He watched the timer on his phone. A second unit arrived 30 seconds behind it. The officers were efficient, and Roy met them at the front steps and gave a brief, clear account, starting from the moment the back door sound woke him. He showed them the camera footage. The backdoor camera had captured her arrival. The side unit had caught her at the window before she entered, and they reviewed it quickly and confirmed what they needed. 2 officers went around the side to the back. The others stayed at the front with Roy. He waited on the porch. Nancy had not attempted to leave. When the officers entered through the back door, she was standing at the kitchen counter with a knife lying flat on the surface in front of her. She was crying when the second officer came through the doorway. Not the theatrical kind Roy had seen during the divorce proceedings, but something quieter and more depleted, the crying of a person who has reached the far inner road she chose and found that the end looked exactly as it looked. She did not resist. She answered the officer's questions in short, flat sentences. She let them walk her outside. She looked at Roy once as they passed the porch. He looked back. There was nothing he wanted to say. There was nothing she could have said that would have changed anything. He watched them put her in the cruiser and close the door. Then he looked away, because there was nothing left to see. One of the officers took a full statement from him on the porch, then inside, going over each detail methodically. Roy answered every question accurately and without embellishment. He signed the statement. He shook hands. He watched the cruisers pull away from the curb one by one until the street was quiet again. Then he went back inside. He locked the back door. He stood in the kitchen for a moment. The knife was gone, taken as evidence. There was a small scratch on the back door frame where the lock had been worked. Roy ran his thumb along it, estimating. A little wood filler. A little paint. 20 minutes, no more. He got a glass of water, drank it at the sink, and went back to bed. The charges were breaking and entering and criminal threatening with a deadly weapon. Roy received confirmation from Lydia across the morning after. She had called to ensure he was fully aware of his rights and options as the affected party. Given the documentation, the camera footage, your statement, the physical evidence at the door, this is a straightforward case, Lydia told him. There is very little she can argue her way out of. I know, Roy said. Do you want to be contacted if she attempts to negotiate a plea? Roy considered that for a moment. No, he said. Let the court handle it. He did not contact Nancy. He did not answer her calls. She called twice from the county facility, both times from a number he did not pick up, both times leaving no message. A letter arrived 3 weeks later, handwritten, the envelope looking as though it had been worked over several times before being sealed. He could guess at its contents well enough. He set it aside without opening it. He was not in the business of reopening what was closed. The legal process moved at its own pace, the way legal processes do, methodical, slow, and indifferent to anyone's sense of urgency. Roy received updates from Lydia and absorbed them the same way he absorbed equipment reports, with attention but without drama. He kept his house. He kept his schedule. He went to work. In July, he accepted a promotion that the plant manager had been offering for 2 years, assistant director of facilities operations. It came with more responsibility, a modest salary increase, and the particular satisfaction of work that matched his capabilities exactly. He had declined the offer twice before. The first time, Nancy had been pushing for them to relocate closer to the city, and he had not wanted to deepen roots she was already trying to pull up. The second time, the divorce proceedings were consuming his attention. Now, there was nothing in the way. He said yes, and on his first Monday in the new role, he arrived at the plant at 6:30 in the morning and stood in the facility before anyone else arrived and looked at it. All of it, the entire floor, every section, every line, with a clear, quiet sense of a man taking full possession of something that had always been his. He replanted the vegetable garden in late summer, expanding it by 2 rows. He added a raised bed along the south fence for strawberries. He rebuilt the tool storage system in the garage, a proper maple workbench with pegboard backing and organized storage, the kind he had wanted for years and had always deferred. He spent 3 weekends on it, working correctly without rushing. In September, an envelope arrived from the court. Roy opened it at the kitchen table and read through it carefully. Nancy had accepted a plea, 2 years of probation, community service hours, and a restraining order that formalized the distance that already existed in practice. No prison time, which did not particularly matter to Roy one way or another. What mattered was that the legal chapter was finished. The paperwork confirmed what had been true for some time. She was out of his life, and the mechanisms of consequence were doing the work they had been built to do. He filed the envelope in the lockbox with the rest of the documents from that period. The divorce papers, the camera logs, the court records. He organized them by date and set the box back in its place. Someday he might dispose of them. For now, he kept them the way a man keeps evidence of a difficult repair, as a record of what had been broken, what it took to fix it, and what he was capable of. On a Friday evening in early October, Roy came home from work, changed out his clothes, and went out to the backyard. The evening was cooling. The sky above Spokane had gone the particular shade of deep blue it gets in fall. after the summer heat has let go and the air carries that clean, dry quality that hints at winter coming. The pine trees at the back of the yard stood dark against that sky. The vegetable garden had been cleared and composted. The new fence post stood even and straight along the property line. Roy sat down on the back steps and looked at his yard. He was not thinking about Nancy. He was not thinking about the courthouse or the camera footage or the night she had come through his back door holding a knife. He was not thinking about Trent Holloway or Lydia Cross or the letter he had set aside unopened. He was thinking about next year's garden, whether to expand the tomatoes or try something new, whether the raised strawberry bed would need a second layer of soil before winter. He felt, sitting there in the cooling air of that October evening, exactly like himself. Not a harder version, not a sadder or more guarded version. Just himself, steady and clear-eyed and at ease in his own space. The way a man ought to feel in his own backyard on a Friday evening. There had been a time, in the worst of it, when the house had felt like contested ground, every room carrying the low charge of a conflict that had not yet fully arrived. He remembered sitting at the kitchen table in the early mornings before Nancy woke, watching the light change in the window, feeling the weight of what was coming. Not with dread, exactly, but with the bone-deep tiredness of a man carrying something heavy over a long distance. That weight was gone. The house was as the way it had always been his, not by decree, not through a court order, but by the simple and inarguable fact that he had built his life here, piece by piece and year by year, with his own work and his own savings and his own steady attention. He had protected it when it was threatened. He had not let it be taken. And now he sat in it the way he had always sat in it, in the fullness of a life that was entirely and completely his own. The last light faded from the sky. The temperature dropped a few degrees. Somewhere down the street, a neighbor was grilling. Roy could smell the smoke and catch the faint sound of music from a porch. A car pulled into a driveway, 2 houses down. Ordinary sounds on an ordinary Friday evening in the neighborhood outside Spokane, where pine trees lined the streets and every house looked almost the same. Roy sat a while longer on those back steps, and then he got up and went inside and made dinner and lived his life.